Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom with Bob Olson, who will now introduce today's show and speaker.
Welcome to the open door. I have left an open door before you, which no one can close, open to the love of God, open to joining His stream of love for others. And our illustrious panel today features Dr. Rhonda Chervin, professor of philosophy and Catholic writer from Corpus Christi, Texas, Dr. Richard Garrity from Birmingham, Alabama, professor of philosophy at EWTN, writer of books from Aristotle's Ethics, Plato's Republic, also writing a book about Blessed Cardinal Newman's apologetics. Dr. Jim Hannock from Los Angeles, philosophy professor, father of 5 children, pro-life activist, editor at New Oxford Review, and Commander Al Hughes from Corpus Christi, Texas, colonel in the Air Force, a married father who converted to the church from being an agnostic, also has degrees in engineering and in pastoral studies. So let's, and Rhonda has a guest, Dr. Rhonda.
Oh, my guest, Angela, is just listening in.
Okay, good. All right, let's go now to Commander Al. Welcome.
Good morning, Bob and everyone. Our topic today is one that I've had people tell me does not exist. A few people have said that to me, and that is, what is the natural law? It very much does exist, and we've got a whole panel of philosophy doctorates to lay it out for us. So the question today is, what is the natural law? And I'm sure that we'll be speaking of examples as we go along. So who would like to start out with the definition, please?
All right, I'd like to start off, but it wouldn't be a definition, it would be a description. All right, natural law is something very obvious to people if you leave them alone in their natural state. For instance, you have a man and a woman, and people say they're different, and they recognize they can get married, and in the Marriage Act, they fit together. They're designed that way to express their love, and then they have the result of that babies. See? Now, that's not a decree of the government, and it's not the practice of any particular group. I mean, it's nature. It's what human beings all over the globe do. And of course, the churches go along with it. Other institutions go along with it. But that's nature. And people have been doing that for thousands of years. And that's why we have a present generation. Babies have grown up, have become the parents, and then they had babies, and it went on. It's been going on for quite a few thousand years, see? So that's nature. And it's bigger than national, bigger than the church, bigger than any particular, it's just nature. Now, I think I've just articulated what even an illiterate person could agree with. I mean, it's obvious. Now, having said that, in the last 20 years, or the last 50 years, but there's been a very sophisticated attack on what people take for granted as natural. Like number one, you can abort a baby, even though it's a human being. You know, they say it isn't a human being. Or number two, if you're a boy and you want to be a girl, you can switch. If you're a girl, you want to be a boy, you can switch. Entirely unnatural, unheard of, but spread throughout, engineered, like you're advocating soap suds or advocating a car, you're advocating this, and it gets into the mainstream, and it mocks common sense, is stupid, backward, benighted, and all that, and it says get progressive, get open-hearted, get open-minded, and look at it this way. But that's very sophisticated, and to deal with that, of course, you need the educated people to dissect it, all that. But basically, it's fake stuff, but made to look real because of communication. So with that, I think is a setting that I wish to set. Okay, thank you.
Very good, Richard. Very good. Very pithy, right on contemporary. So I have a nice little definition of natural law because I wrote an ethics book about 40 years ago it was originally called Living in Love, about Christian ethics, and then it had many titles as it was reprinted. It's now in my book, Way of Love, republished by En route Books, the sponsor of this station. And so in my book, Way of Love, it's a 4-volume book, and in this book, one of the volumes within the book is about ethics, and it's called Making Loving Moral Decisions. And there's a whole chapter in there on natural law ethics, which I've been teaching for about 40 years. And I like this definition, which comes from Germain Grisey, a very famous Thomistic ethics teacher and writer of the 20th century. And this is the way he puts it. And it's not hard to understand if you listen, and I say it very, very slowly. Moral goodness and badness can be discerned by comparing essential patterns of possible human actions with the intelligible structure of human nature. Okay, so the intelligible structure of human nature, as Richard just said, is that a man and a woman are different, and they have sexual organs which are reproductive. That's the structure of human nature. So then you look at a possible human action, such as changing your sex. You look and you say, does that fit the structure of human nature? See?
Right.
Well, I think those are stellar contributions to get us launched. But there is, as always, more thinking to do. One place to think would be to think with a common doctor, to Thomas Aquinas, who says, among other things, that natural law is our participation, our way of sharing in God's eternal law. And it's not just the human person that participates in God's eternal law. All created things participate in God's eternal law in one way or another. Our participation is extraordinarily interesting because we do so freely. Animals don't have free will, and so they can't help but participate fully in God's law, eternal law.
Right.
But we do, and so our participation is very, very complex. But the grounding of natural law for a Christian is God's eternal law, and we, insofar as we participate in God's eternal law, are following natural law. In the course of thought, especially modern thought, but not only modern thought, many different accounts of natural law have been proposed, and many of these accounts have not been keyed to or based on God's eternal law. For example, there are many people who are said to be into natural rights tradition. And oftentimes the natural rights tradition has had good things to say, but it has done so without any kind of anchoring in God's eternal law. And that's one of the reasons why we have this incredible multiplication of rights. Another consideration is that when we think of natural law from the perspective of Catholic philosophy, we have the idea that human nature is ordered to a full realization of its potential. We are ordered towards the realization of fundamental human goods. And if we only stay at a descriptive level, we could say, well, descriptively, among other things, nature has been read in tooth and claw. And we could say, merely descriptively, it seems as if every time human beings have developed a new technology, they've employed it to expand their sphere of freedom. That seems to be something that we do. And now that we can do X, Y, and Z to control reproduction, isn't it part of our nature to employ our intelligence to do so? Well, one might say it's part of our nature to use our intelligence as well as we can. But if we divorce that from the goods of human personhood, then that's a distortion of a natural propensity to use our intelligence.
That's excellent. That's an excellent way to put the argument about the pill, about the justification of artificial contraception. So there was a recognition, you could call it natural rights of the way children were conceived. And then they said, well, there are certain inconveniences to that, so why don't we use a pill as an invention of human reason to ease out the difficulties and make the process of reproduction a little more predictable, manageable, because of the complications of modern life. Now, the distinction you made between the natural rights people who don't necessarily look to make it part of the eternal law of God allows that kind of thinking. But if it's the law of God, there's a divine sanction for the natural way people marry and have children, and you can't mess with it. And if you mess with it, it's a moral evil. It's a sin. It's an intrinsic evil. See, for the natural rights people, there is no such thing as a moral evil or an intrinsic evil. You can manipulate it with a new way of reason, and reason invented the pill. Science comes to the aid. Why not? But with the natural law fully explained in Thomas, it's a sin. It's an intrinsic evil. It's a violation of human nature. Now, you can't put that kind of weight unless you hook the natural way of doing things in with the way God wants it done.
That's really true, Richard. On the other hand, there's another factor here that's very interesting, which is, okay, you invent the pill, which is something over and above the natural creative, the creation in the body, the reproductive aspect of the human body. You invent this thing, and you think this is great. And it turns out that most people who drop the pill and look into natural family planning do not do so because they think it's morally wrong to use the pill. It's because it's filled with horrible side effects, one of them being abortifacient, which means if the pill doesn't manage to flush out the new embryo, if the first aspect of the pill doesn't prevent the sperm and the egg from meeting, the other aspect of the pill flushes out the already formed embryo. Now, just in biology classes in a public school, if someone was teaching the biology of the human being, they would certainly say that it's a big moment in this process when the sperm and the egg meet and form the embryo. Okay, so now by violating this natural process, you get all this awful side effects. So even just on the basis of nature, there's a famous little saying that I like very much, which is other people sometimes forgive, God always forgives, nature never forgives.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a way in which, even though ultimately, I would say, without bringing in God, because ultimately, if you only think of a human person as piles of cells, just a material blob, why would anything be right or wrong, But if people don't think that way, even if they're total atheists and materialists. Why? Because somehow they intuit, in the sense of intellectually understanding, not guesses, but they have some sort of intellectual understanding that there are things that are really wrong. So I've never met a single atheist. I was brought up by atheists who didn't think anything was wrong. See, they weren't total skeptics. Why? Because you can't live as a total skeptic. Because it's certainly when you're the victim, you always want to say that's wrong, even if you're an atheist, right?
Right, and I think that brings up the point of, especially in our culture, which is pretty utilitarian, the priests have to bring up in church following the natural way is also following God's way. The deviation will not only make you pay through nature, the deviate may not just foul up your reproductive system. It's a deadly sin against the order of God. It's an intrinsic evil. But in our culture, the priest is going to have to say it. The bishop is going to have to say it. They're going to have to push it. See? And listen, that's a hard thing to push in the face of a very utilitarian, rationalistic culture in which people are trying to improve nature. See? It's going to sound old-fashioned, backward, regressive, and all that. And that's where the church has failed in hooking up in the question of artificial contraception. Now, for abortion, it's pretty obvious. Killing is killing. It is not so obvious in today's culture, which is very utilitarian, that artificial contraception is an intrinsic evil. It violates God's intention of what the sexual act is for. And I say that it call for heroism on the part of the bishops and the priests and Catholics to push that point in our atmosphere today. And because it's going to sound so outrageous. And that's why, of course, it hasn't been pushed. But
okay, one way that some priests do this very effectively, because they're not sure, they don't know how to present this well, they bring in the couple-to-couple league, the couple-to-couple league people who teach natural family planning. They have them give a talk on how natural family planning is different from contraception and how it's getting simpler and simpler. Now they have a new method where you just touch your tongue to your iPhone and you can tell if you're fertile or not. So wow. they bring in the expert lay people to teach this. And then all they have to do is say, look, contraception is wrong. If you're using it, go to this class. And then they let the lay people who have been studying this for years present it.
That's right. That's a good description of what actually happens. And yet, sometimes when it comes to straight preaching, the people are not being tutored that way. The priest has to bring up this uncomfortable thought that, whether you realize it or not, artificial consciousness is an intrinsic evil. And saying it to people who don't understand it, who don't want to hear it, yet someone got to say it from the beginning. And then once you say that, sure, then you take other means to make it more palatable. But someone got to pop the terrible, terrible prohibition. It's an intrinsic evil. You can't let people find that out for themselves. They should be told. Shepherds should guide the sheep. And that takes a lot of guts today. It always has taken guts to go against a popular understanding.
As you know, Richard and I met when we were both teaching at a certain seminary. And you know as well as I that not all teachers at the seminary teach this well either.
Right. And
so
then they don't even bring up...
Then the priest is totally confused, and so he's better off getting the couple-to-couple league in than trying to figure it out.
But that's a loss of nerve on the part of the priest. If they're obedient, they should follow people who know better, like Cardinal Ratzinger or the Pope, and say, look, it's an intrinsic evil. Maybe I don't understand it. Maybe I can't explain it, but I know it's an intrinsic evil because the Pope has said so. Now, you're going to look like a dumb sheep just following a shepherd there, but that's the truth of it. You are a sheep, and the Pope is the shepherd, and you shouldn't be able to show that you're on blind faith, as they say, and you try to read up on it and get smarter, but that's your start. You're a priest, and you're a sheep, and you obey what the shepherd says without understanding it. That example has to be predominant in the life of a priest. Otherwise, you got to study a question for 5 years before you back up the Pope. That ain't the way it works.
If I could jump in here, Jim, as it happens, right now I'm at a conference at Thomas Aquinas College, very enjoyable and very much a place of learning and thinking with and for the church. It is also a very statistically unusual place. Let me say that in the larger culture, a couple of other things are going on that are worth noting. Sometimes when people present natural law, they give a very bare bones version of it in order to communicate to a broader audience. Sometimes people will say, for example, that the core of natural law is a belief that there is an objective moral order, and that at least in many cases, right reason can lead us to see what that objective moral order is.
Right.
Now, if we could get that far, we would have made a lot of progress. But perhaps, who can count all the heads? Perhaps in the larger culture, the dominant view is, yes, utilitarianism, but combined with that, something that's oftentimes called expressivism. And in a way, expressivism is more fundamental than utilitarianism. The utilitarian will say that all goods can be measured against each other and all evils can be measured against each other, and what we want to do is maximize the good over the bad, and that's assuming that there's this commensuration possible, and it also assumes that we agree on what the goods are. We can't be measuring the goods and the bads if we don't agree on what they are. And so then we come to the question, what is good and what is bad? And here I'm pushing towards this more fundamental position, expressivism. It's sometimes called emotivism, but it's had several decades of percolating. And the expressivist will say, when I say that such and such is good, what that fundamentally means is I'm expressing my support of it. I'm expressing my wanting it to be the case. So the good is not something built into the structure of creation. The good is always a private good, and it's always the object of what one prefers or it wants to express as that which is good to me. Now, it's one thing.
Let's give an example so it helps the listener. Let's give an example
if I say something like, well, it's different strokes for different folks, but as far as I'm concerned, I'd like a stable marriage. It just seems like it's a whole lot more sensible to me. And then you express your view that a stable marriage is a good thing, not because it has anything to do ultimately with God's created order, not because there is some objective moral order independently of or prescinding from God's creation, but simply because that's for me. That's for me.
That's a great example. Example.
That's for me. And a whole lot of people read about the doings of the stars and the starlets and say, geez, that must be exhausting. Interesting to read about, but that's not for me, right? And what they're taking to be good is good in the sense that it's what they have a feeling of attraction for, all things considered. But then since feelings vary widely, not completely, but widely, we can't even get to utilitarianism because we don't agree on what the goods are that have to be tabulated. So at some intellectual level, the fight has to be carried on with regard to, is there an objective moral order? And then, what's the source of the objective moral order? Then, how is it that a free person operates respecting freedom and within the context of the objective moral order? So it's a many-front war,
right,
or let's say a many-front dialectic. But now here's the nasty part. Because I'm here at this conference, I have to go to the conference. So I'm going to have to sign off for now.
Oh,
it starts at 9 o'clock. What time is it? What time is it in your world? Is it almost 12?
No, it's 11:30 Eastern Time, 10:30 Central Time.
All right, then if it's only half past, I've got another 15 minutes to rattle on or to be rattled on.
Good. So, no, you're on a good track. Keep going.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was it.
Yeah, that was it. This is Al, if I can get in between a couple of three philosophers. At the very beginning, I mentioned that several people had told me there really was no such thing as natural law. In one of those cases, it was very clear that the person who told me that his rationale was there can be no natural law because there is no God. That was his real argument. He wasn't denying natural law, he was denying God, the very existence of God. And that, of course, I think is the core of our problem, is so many people just as science is now proving that there is a God, the mass population is denying God because they're still following the natural conclusions from 19th century science, which has certainly been surpassed by the latest that's going on. We actually have the astrophysicists have now proven that there has to be a God. So that's the problem. Part of the problem is as far afield as science itself, and getting the modern science word out to the ignorant population that's still following Newton and others of earlier centuries. So where does that go? I think that's the fundamental problem, and that's why we have what Jim was talking about, and which all, to me, seems to fall under the one heading of relativism.
Okay, I have a little refutation for that idea that doesn't bring in God. Now, this is the way I'd like to refute this quickly. Say, okay, you're speeding 90 miles down a freeway where the speed limit is 65. The policeman catches up to you. Do you think you could get away with saying, well, my preference for the greater happiness of me is to drive 90, and since there are no moral absolutes, you can't give me a ticket?
Yeah, that doesn't work, does it?
It wouldn't work. So it just doesn't work. Denying natural law, even on a human thing, even on human premises, without bringing in God, I think it's better to have God in the mix, absolutely. I mean, that's the fundamental source of natural law because he creates human beings. But given that human beings exist, even an atheist has to see that you couldn't have a society that he would like himself if you had no law and order. So there has to be some intrinsic evil in just doing your own thing with no sense of ethics.
Yes, I can say, we can say that to have a proper idea of natural law, you got to have God. Now, and the point is, God, of course, then is the creator, and we're the creature. Now, since we're not God, we're not the creator, we're the creature, we should follow what the creator says. In other words, authority is an essential feature in our life as a creature. Authority is the authority of God. And that's where you have your objective standard of right or wrong. But if there's no God, then everything is permissible. And like one of the speakers has said, the natural rights position doesn't include God so much, so it's subject to all kind of wiggling and waggling, which is what we've experienced in American culture.
This is Bob. When I first learned about natural law, a person said, a thief doesn't understand it until somebody steals from him. Does that make sense?
Say that again?
A thief, a person that steals.
Right.
It doesn't make any. Natural law doesn't make any sense until someone steals from him. Very good, very good.
Yeah, like a hired killer. He's bumping off other people. It's a way of business. But if someone goes to bump him off or his family, it's outrageous. It's unfair. The guy is murdering. Right. That's a good irony, yeah. Even the crook acknowledges natural when it happened to him. Right. That's a good example.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's the case for perhaps a great many people. They have a rude awakening. On the other hand, and this goes back to ancient philosophy, there's a document that comes from one of the Greek historians. I can't recall the name right off, and it has to do with a case brought against the Athenians. We tend to think of Athens as, where the good guys were. A case brought against the Athenians by the people of, as I recall, Miletus. And what the people of Miletus say is that we've always been independent until now. Why is it that you think you can take control over us? This isn't right. This isn't fair. And the response from the Athenians is, well, as far as we can see, we can take control over you without any consequences to us. And justice actually, in fact, is the rule of the strong. And this whole notion that people are going to see justice as something intrinsically good, I think may be the case in a number of cases, but there are any number of people who say, I'm willing to take the risk and let the chips fall where they may, and let's get going. Let's get into battle. May the strongest person win.
Right.
And there's not a recognition that, oh gosh, I might get hurt, or I did get hurt, and so I guess I see what everybody's talking about. Rather, the view is, damn, I lost. Geez, I hope there's another round.
Right. See, that comes down to, is it right? Is it might that makes right?
Yes.
Or is it right that justifies the use of might? It's either or.
Yes, and from the get-go of Western civilization, at least, this has been fiercely disputed. If you want to read a dialogue that's pretty readable and really rings true, there's a Platonic dialogue called the Gorgias.
Right, right.
And in the Gorgias, this whole question is debated at great length, and what's really interesting is that there's an effort to describe what politics is, and Socrates, Plato's spokesman, Socrates says, well, you know, you said a lot of things about politics, but best as I can see, it's a form of rhetoric. And rhetoric is all about persuading people. And that's what politics in practice is really all about. And if you look at the history of Greek politics, the people who have come out on top have been very good in terms of rhetoric. But again and again, they've turned out to be despots. And
right.
So we've got to rethink things here. And Thrasymachus, who's the bad guy in the dialogue, and Callicles. Callicles is the bad guy in the dialogue, and a former student of Socrates says, gee, Socrates, I used to love to bat these ideas around when I was a student. And it looks to me like you just never outgrew it, did you, Socrates? I mean, we got to get on with the program.
Oh, God. Well, let's go to, maybe we should go to one of the hugest things, exemplifications of this, is the whole issue of abortion, in this sense, that those who are just thinking pros and cons of what do I think would bring me the greatest happiness, so they easily get into a thing of, well, okay, pro-keeping the baby is my parents won't get mad at me. Against it is my parents will throw me out if they know I'm pregnant. Things like this. Not taking the idea that a tiny little baby no bigger than your hand has rights that doesn't even come into it when you're just thinking pros and cons of what might bring the greatest happiness to me in terms of my little idea of happiness, which doesn't include maybe the feeling guilty for 50 years from doing it, and so forth. So it's a huge thing, but to recognize that something is wrong when it's legal is very, very difficult for people to recognize, because meanwhile they've been brought up in a culture where they're being taught these are the means of contraception. Abortion is a backup for contraception if it doesn't work. And so, I mean, the number of people who are the number of women who were educated to see that it would be better to die than kill a baby, is minuscule. So, so we have this thing, even though we could prove by natural law ethics why abortion is wrong, we're dealing with being an extreme minority and things like that, right? I mean, it seems that people are saying that nowadays more people in the culture are pro-life than pro-abortion. I don't know where they're getting that statistic from, but many of those people would probably be saying, yeah, I'm against late-term abortions, but I'm certainly not against the morning-after pill, which flushes the baby out if you got pregnant when you have sex last night.
See, that's why, from what you brought up, Rhonda, there has to be a teaching of fear of the Lord. And that has to come in church, in the solemn setting of a certain fear of doing moral evil. Otherwise, our ego gets in there, and like we're the kingpins deciding what pleases us and not pleases us, we need something built into us to have us be a little shaky on the ground we walk, or a little fearful, or when it comes to certain things, be very, very careful and almost have it built into us as a reflex, and I'd call it fear of the Lord. See, a religion without fear of the Lord ain't a real religion. I mean, you can't be all love and you do things voluntarily. There has to be a fear of the Lord, the consciousness that you're a creature or a sheep, and you're often stupid and willful. There has to be that sense. In other words, a good dose of a certain amount of negative identity. And they say, oh, that's terrible, don't be negative. No, you need the negative. Hell's a pretty negative idea. You need it.
I knew you'd get to that. All right, dear friends, I'm going to have to sign off, and I'll be in touch via email, okay?
Okay.
All right, God bless.
God bless. This is Al. I'd like to interject something here, and I think it may be even more of an insidious problem, and that is willful ignorance. And I'm going to give two examples of that. The first being even when it was clear that slavery wasn't, I'll call it an intrinsic evil, many people simply would not look at that. And so the British got rid of slavery in 1823, and it was still another whole generation before we got the word here.
Right.
Because in part because of economic reasons, particularly in the South, but also this kind of a willful ignorance, not willing to look at what slavery is.
Right.
That's one example. The other one comes when I was sitting in a political rally waiting for Newt Gingrich to show up, and he was very late. And the woman next to me and I got to talking, and she referenced the child in the room as, when we got to the subject, she called it that little blob, whatever it is. And that was her summary statement of what a child in the womb was, that little blob, whatever it is. That, when you can see pictures of that are children in the womb today, that's what I call willful ignorance on her part. She did not want to look at the truth.
Right.
And I think many people would rather look at their own convenience than look at the truth.
And therefore, evil, in inches, it can be very attractive to us. It looks like an advantage.
So long as you can maintain that willful ignorance, yes.
Right. You don't want to look at it. If you look at it, it might deprive you of something. You don't want to be deprived of it. Don't look at it. That's sensible, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a form of greed, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
I believe that's one of the 7 deadlies.
Right.
Well, the whole thing of slavery, I started researching that because when I was teaching ethics, we'd get into that subject. In this form, you get into that subject. People would say, well, just as the church changed its mind, this is the way it was put, about slavery, and so in the same way the church could change its mind about contraception. So I decided to research this whole thing on Catholic ethics involving slavery.
Right.
And so it's not quite as simple as we want to think it is in this way, that people, the ethical writers who I read on this subject, and also the people who were tracing Catholic teaching on this, you have the situation in biblical times where the choice was you either be killed on the battlefield or you become a slave if you're captured. You either become killed or a slave. So being a slave seemed better to most people. Okay. Then the treatment of slaves in Africa, in America, is quite different than the way Jews in the Old Testament were supposed to treat slaves, which was more like what was called indentured servants, in the sense that there was a sort of contract on this person you got captured, who became the slave, but you had to treat them fairly well. You weren't, just because they were slaves didn't mean that you could, whip them and do horrible things to them. It was, so I don't know about exactly the word whipping, but anyway, there was a different standard of this. So the idea that having a slave in itself is intrinsically evil is not what was taught in Christian teaching in the early days, either in biblical times or the early church. However, it was always taught that treating slaves cruelly was a sin. Then you get to the slave trade. So the Vatican, different popes came out with anti-slave trade ethics, where they said it was intrinsically evil to sell a person. On the other hand, if you had a person and you treated them well, that wasn't necessarily intrinsically evil. So there's a kind of development of doctrine there that, because they were Catholic, the Jesuit order had slaves in the United States. So it wasn't, this developed more and more, but the slave trade was always condemned officially by the popes. The popes were generally the ones who were most against it. And then gradually the sense that in itself owning another human being is intrinsically wrong. After all, people own serfs. It's not so simple. That's all I want to say.
Right. No, that's a good point. That contraception is an intrinsic evil, and you can pin that down, and there's no exception. When you get the term slavery, there are different types throughout history, and it doesn't have a single nature like the intrinsic evil of contraception. It's a bird of a lot of different varieties.
So natural law ethics, there are some principles of natural law ethics which are absolutely clear and can be taught with no exceptions kind of thing. And then there are other ones where you can say there are no exceptions, but then you have to define it correctly.
Right.
So no one says lying is wrong is the principle, but you have to define lying. Is it a lie if your wife says, I just bought this new hat, and don't I look beautiful in this hat? And you think the hat is hideous, but you say, that's nice, and you mean in your head, I like the color. You think that. So is that a sin of lying? See, so you get into all this, moral theologians get into all these kind of things as to defining the intrinsic evil in the correct way, so that the things that we obviously see have to be exceptions are not called exceptions. They're just called, that the definition of a lie isn't saying something that's a half-truth. It's saying something that's absolutely false. So
Right,
if you like the color, you can say it's a nice hat.
And also a serious matter, I believe. The common expression is the white lie, which is the pleasant comment about a hat that looks hideous. Yeah, that's the white lie. It brings peace in the family rather than warfare. That's a good.
See, the interesting thing is sometimes you hear discussions of natural law, and then they get into these crazy cases. The Gestapo comes and and they get into that, and they go around and around and around and around. And frankly, if you run into enough of that, it gets boring, And instead of focusing on the most difficult point or casuists got to break their heads over, they miss out on the larger notion of natural law, which is pretty obvious. It isn't that complicated. You don't have to be a genius to follow the distinctions. So,
and sometimes people get off the beam because of a translation problem. As, for instance, "Thou shalt not kill." I don't know what the original word was in Aramaic, but perhaps it should have been translated "Thou shalt not murder," which is a little different than killing. It's and my teaching over the years at various RCIA groups, that was my point. Was there are killing? The translation is so important.
Right.
The exact meaning of what was originally intended. And I am convinced that when the Lord says, "Thou shalt not kill," or Moses said it, or God spoke to Moses, "Thou shalt not kill," I suspect the real translation was, "Thou shalt not murder." There are times when it's either kill or be killed. And Rhonda and several others of us have gotten into that discussion on occasion.
Well, the point is that obviously God couldn't mean by "thou shalt not kill" you shouldn't kill a cow. You shouldn't kill. When God said go and kill, you get rid of all these people. God ordered them to kill in that sense because they weren't innocent people. So it has to mean murder, which is killing an innocent person.
Yeah, right, as opposed to warfare, which is a messy business to begin with.
See, and yet the point is God, He can kill people, even if they're innocent. I mean, that's His prerogative. I mean, it doesn't sound right, but I mean, God can work things that thousands and thousands, millions of innocent people die. For instance, He allows abortion where millions of innocent people are killed. But
allows in the sense of permits it to happen, not that he allows it morally, but He permits it.
Right, He permits it. It's within His power not to allow that, but He allows it. But He's God, see, and we're not. That's the point. We're not God, and we're constrained or conditioned not to, because we're not God. God is not constrained.
Have we talked ourselves out? We still have a few more minutes.
I find it amazing that two philosophers can't find a word to say. I think we've talked it out, haven't we?
Yeah.
We need Jim back on the line.
Well, see, he's been teaching this so has Richard. Richard you teach natural law, and Jim teaches natural law. I teach ethics, and I have a segment on natural law. And I find, let me talk about that. I find natural law is very clear and easy to teach compared to other forms of ethics, which I think, other approaches to ethics, which I think are good and are more persuasive in a certain way. Like if you're talking about intuitive ethics, which in the sense of intellectual apprehension of the wrongness of something. So we don't just keep the speed limits because it's for the common good. It's better if you keep the speed limit because you have an intellectual apprehension of the wrongness of someone dying on the road because you were speeding for fun. If you have that gutsy feeling of how horrible that is, then it's more motivational, I find. But on the other hand, the natural law way of describing these things is very clear. So anyone can see that you need to have law and order if you're going to have any kind of community or society whatsoever. You need to have law and order, so you should obey the speed limit. So I find very few traditional Catholic philosophers always obey the speed laws to the dot. Incidentally.
Have you taken a survey on that?
Well, just from observation, driving with them. Whenever I bring this up, the students look with horror. You mean you have to obey the speed laws?
That's a good example. Yeah, you have to obey it because of the common good, see? Right? And yet, even a Catholic philosopher can play fast and loose with that.
Great. Bob, I think we're about out of time.
Yeah, we got 2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. Let me introduce then the topic for next week. And I don't recall who suggested it, but the topic is aging and its effect on humility. That should be good. That should be a good free-for-all. Aging and its effect on humility, and I think a few of us are probably experts in some part of that.
Oh, we're getting there.
We are getting there, all of us. So that is the topic for next week, and if anybody has a last word, we probably have a few seconds available.
Well, we just say we'll be back again same time, same station next week. And in the meantime, may God bless everybody in listening and everybody that was with us today. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
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 We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.